This was Arizona territory, a raw cut of land bled dry by a sun that never relented. The year was somewhere around 1888, or perhaps 1889, a time measured less by calendars than by the depth of the dust and the height of the fear. Dry River County was the name on the maps, but the name was a liar. The rivers were bones of sand, and the only water trickled deep underground, a secret kept by the willow roots and the desperate. This land had belonged to the Ende, the Apache, long before any maps came. It was their holy ground, their hunting ground, taken by treaty and by force, and it held its breath, remembering. The air was thin and hot, smelling of greasewood and something ancient, something angry. On a slope of land swept by wind, where the grama grass struggled to hold the soil, lived Eliza Boone. Most folks in the town of Dry River just called her Liza. Her ranch was small, a handful of acres clinging to the rock, with a low adobe house the color of the earth itself, and a barn that leaned with the prevailing wind. She lived alone. She had lived alone since her father, a cavalryman with a tired heart, had passed on 3 years back. Liza was 22 years of age. She was known in Dry River for two things: her plain way of speaking, and her face. When she was 12 years old, a lantern in the old barn had overturned. She had saved the horses, all 3 of them, but the fire had kissed her as she ran clear. It left its mark, a puckered, paler stretch of skin that ran from her left temple, down her cheek, to the line of her jaw. In the town of Dry River, this mark defined her. To the people, she was not Liza Boone, the woman who could gentle a wild horse or set a broken leg on a calf. She was, in the cruel shorthand of saloon talk and quiet judgment, the ugliest girl in the county. They treated the scar not as an injury, but as a judgment, a bad omen. Men in the saloon would stop their talk when she entered the general store, their laughter pausing just long enough to make its silence a weapon, before starting again, louder. Women would pull their children closer, as if the scar were a sickness one could catch. The children, learning from their parents, would sometimes gather to chant names, words she had long since learned to wall against. But the wall was strong. Liza Boone was tough, a fact the land itself had taught her. The desert did not care about the smoothness of one's skin. It cared about resilience. She was a master with horses. Her hands, though calloused, were knowing and kind. She could read the sky for weather and the earth for water, and she could read the books her father had left behind. He had been a soldier, yes, but he had believed in words. He taught her to read, to write, to cipher. He gave her an education that made her sharper than many of the men who laughed at her. This knowledge was her armor, her private solace. She missed him with a dull, constant ache. The land itself was a living thing, a character in her solitary life. The vast, aching expanse of the Sonoran Desert surrounded her. It was a place of terrible beauty, of wind that cut and sand that scoured. It demanded respect, and it held secrets, like the hidden veins of water, the promise of life that kept her there. This season, however, the desert felt wrong. The air was heavy, charged. It was a season of freak storms, of winds that came from the wrong direction. The sky, for days at a time, would turn a strange, sick shade of green, a color that spoke of poison and violence. The old-timers called it a curse. Liza just called it weather, but she felt the wrongness of it in her bones. One evening, as this green light painted the world, she was mending a fence line at the edge of her property. The air was unnervingly still. No birds sang, no insects chirped. There was only the scrape of her tools and the sound of her own breathing. Then she heard it, faint, from the direction of the far-off Chiricahua Mountains. A sound like a low heartbeat, a steady, rhythmic pulse, drums. She froze, listening. The sound was there. Then it was gone, carried off by a sudden gust of wind. She looked up, high above, so high it was almost a speck. A single hawk circled. It rode the unseen currents, round and round, a patient, watching eye in the dying green sky. Liza knew the stories. Her father had told her. The drum, the circling hawk, they were Apache signs. They were omens. They meant something was coming. She finished her work quickly, her movements economical, her eyes scanning the horizon. Back in the small adobe house, she lit a single lantern. The weak yellow light fought against the green twilight pressing at the window. She sat at her small, scarred wooden table and pulled out a ledger. Her father had taught her to keep accounts, and the numbers were stark. She owed money, a loan against the ranch, taken for seed and new stock after a drought 2 years prior. The note was held by one man, Clayton Voss. The name felt like grit in her mouth. Voss owned the sprawling stockyards that choked the edge of town. He was a county councilman, a man whose voice was always loud, whose smile was always wide, and whose eyes were always calculating. He wanted her land. He wanted the access it gave to the hidden springs. He had made his demands clear, polite on the surface, but with a steel threat beneath. And there was no one to appeal to. Marshal Cobb, the man paid to keep the peace, was a man who understood power. He kept his boots shined and his hat brushed. He spoke often of the law, but he never seemed to see the way the men working for Voss leaned on homesteaders, or the way fences were mysteriously cut. Cobb's justice was for men like Voss, not for a woman with a scarred face and a few acres of dust. Liza closed the ledger. The fear was cold inside her. This ranch was all she had. It was her father's memory, her only home. She would not lose it. This was her first thought. Always, but beneath it, quieter, was another, deeper ache. It was the loneliness of being looked at, but never seen. She was so tired of being the scar. She longed, with a quiet, fierce desperation, just to be seen as a person, as a human being. The wind picked up, a low moan around the corners of the house. The green sky was darkening to a bruised purple. The land, her land, felt as if it were waiting. The drums she had heard, the circling hawk, they were part of that waiting. They were reminders that she was not the first person to fight for this ground. The ND, the Apache, had been here. They were still here. Shadows in the mountains, whispers on the wind. The townsfolk spoke of them with fear, but Liza, in her solitude, felt a strange kinship. They were survivors, just as she was. There were stories in town, stories of a warrior, a ghost, who moved through the Chiricahua range, a man they called Tazin, a name that meant silence or still wind. They said he had appeared out of a blinding sandstorm last year to guide a lost family, settlers, to water, leaving them at the edge of town before vanishing back into the dust. A protector, not a raider. Liza had heard the story. She thought it was just that, a story told around fires to frighten children and comfort adults. She had her own problems. She had Clayton Voss, she had Marshal Cobb, and she had the rising, moaning wind. She put the ledger away and checked the heavy bar on her door. The storm was coming. The moan of the wind became a shriek. It was no longer a sound. It was a physical weight pressing against the small house. Liza Boone stood at her window, her hand on the rough adobe wall, feeling the vibration in her bones. The bruised purple of the sky had given way, churning into that same sick green color from the days before. But now it was darker, shot through with a blackness that seemed to be boiling. Far away, miles distant in the town of Dry River, she heard the frantic, thin clang of the church bell. It was not a summons to prayer. It was a cry of terror. The sound of her horses, a high, panicked screaming, cut through the wind. Her heart seized. They were her only real wealth, the last living connection to her father. She grabbed her heaviest coat, her movements jerky, her mind racing. The barn. She had to get to the barn, to calm them, to what? There was nothing to be done against a wind like this, a wind that sounded like a freight train bearing down on her small patch of earth. She threw open the heavy plank door and the wind ripped it from her hand. Slamming it back against the wall with a crack, she stepped out into chaos. The air was no longer air. It was a solid wall of moving grit and debris. She bent double, fighting for every step toward the barn. She could see it, swaying, the wooden structure groaning in protest. One of the horses, a young mare, kicked against the stall, the sound of splintering wood lost in the greater roar. Then, out of the corner of her eye, through the stinging brown haze, she saw it, a darker shape against the gray light, slumped near the west fence line. At first, she thought it was a calf, or perhaps a coyote caught in the open, but it was too large. It was still the barn roof, the one she and her father had re-shingled 2 summers ago, peeled back like the lid on a tin. It did not fly away in one piece. It disintegrated, exploding into a cloud of wooden shards that vanished into the swirling dark. The screaming of the horses turned into a sound of pure, animal despair. Liza stopped. Her body was pulled in 2 directions. To her left, the barn, her horses, her entire livelihood. To her right, 50 yards away, that still, dark shape. A person. She could not reach the horses. The air was full of things that could kill her. The barn itself was coming apart. To go that way was suicide. To go to the man that was also suicide. Just a different direction. She made no conscious choice. Her legs just moved. She turned from the dissolving barn, put her back to the wind as much as she could, and fought her way toward the fence. She stumbled, fell to her knees, the gravel tearing at her palms, and crawled the last few feet. He was a man. He lay face down, his body curled against the lowest wire of the fence, as if he had tried to crawl under it and failed. She grabbed his shoulder, shouting words that the wind tore from her mouth. "Get up, you must get up." He did not move. He was heavy, solid. She turned him over. His face was angular, his skin the color of worn copper. His hair was long and black, matted with dirt and something dark and wet. A turquoise necklace, bright blue even in the poison light, was stark against his dark leather shirt. He was, she guessed, around 30 years old, and he was unconscious. A deep, ugly gash ran across his temple, the blood already beginning to congeal with the dust. There was no time. The world was ending. Liza looked back at her house. The kitchen. Under the kitchen was the small storm cellar, a hole dug into the hard caliche, roofed with heavy railroad ties and covered in earth. It was their only hope. She hooked her hands under his arms. He was all dead weight. She pulled. She was strong. Her life had made her strong, but the wind was stronger. It tried to pry him from her grasp. "No, you do not," she gasped, setting her feet. She did not pull him. She dragged him, walking backward, her head down, her scarred cheek burning from the sand-blasting wind. Each step was a battle. She fell, got up, fell again. The 50 yards were a mile. She reached the kitchen door, which was flapping on one hinge. She dragged him over the threshold, the floorboard slick with the rain and mud that had already forced its way inside. The trapdoor to the cellar was in the center of the room. She let him fall, his head hitting the wood with a dull sound that made her wince. She fumbled with the iron ring, pulling the heavy door open. A smell of damp earth, potatoes, and mold rose to meet her. She shoved him, rolling his inert body toward the hole. He tumbled down the few rough steps, landing on the dirt floor below. She grabbed a half-empty sack of grain, a tin of matches from the stove, and her father's old cavalry pistol from its peg. She threw them down, then scrambled into the darkness, pulling the heavy trapdoor shut just as the kitchen window above her exploded inward. The darkness was absolute, and the sound, it was worse. Now, above ground, it had been a roar. Down here, it was the sound of the world being ground to pieces, magnified by the earth itself. She could feel the vibration through her boots, a low, terrible tremor. Her hands shook, but she found the match tin. She struck one. The tiny flare of light was blinding. It died. She struck another, and this time managed to light the stub of a candle she kept on a small shelf. The light illuminated their prison. It was tiny, no more than 6 feet by 6 feet, and low enough that she could not stand fully upright. Sacks of potatoes, jars of preserves, and tools lined the walls, and on the floor, The man. He moaned. A low sound. He was alive. He stirred, and then his lips moved. He spoke words, not in English, not in Spanish. It was a guttural, flowing sound. The language of the ND, the language of the Apache. Liza stared. The town's fear, the stories, the warnings she had just dragged an Apache warrior into her cellar. Well, she muttered to the damp air, her voice sounding strange and small. I suppose the wind does not care about politics. She moved to him. The head wound was bad, but the bleeding seemed to have slowed. She needed to clean it, to bind it. She had no bandages. She looked around, frantic. She found a clean burlap feed sack. It was rough, but it was all she had. She tore a strip from it. In a crate, she had dried yucca fibers, tough as leather, that she used for mending horse tackle. She pulled several strips free. She knelt beside him. His breathing was shallow. She gently cleaned the wound as best she could with a cloth dipped in her water canteen. He flinched, even in unconsciousness. She placed the burlap pad over the gash and wrapped the yucca strips around his head, tying them tight. A makeshift, savage sort of bandage. He was cold. The dampness of the cellar was seeping into him. On a raised stone platform, there was a small iron brazier with a few lingering coals she had shoveled in from the stove before the storm hit. A last-minute preparation. She stirred them, blew on them. A faint red glow returned. It was not enough to warm the cellar, but it was something. She found a flat stone, heated it by the coals, wrapped it in another piece of sackcloth, and laid it against his chest. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard. The man was settled. She had done what she could. She looked at the blood on her hands, then at his face, peaceful now in the flickering light. I will not charge interest on this debt, she whispered. The words were for herself, a bitter joke aimed at Clayton Voss. Then the earth moved. A sound like a giant's fist slammed into the ground just outside the cellar. The walls shook, and fine streams of dirt poured from the ceiling boards above. A trickle of water, dark with mud, began to snake its way down the cellar wall. Liza scrambled from the man. The storm was not done. The trickle became a stream. It was running toward the sacks of potatoes, toward their small supply of dry goods. She grabbed other, half-empty sacks of sand she kept for just this purpose, and began building a small dam. The water pooled, then found a new path. A groan came from above. Not the wind, wood. She held the candle up. One of the heavy railroad ties that formed the ceiling was sagging. A crack, dark and thin, ran down its center. It was the main support. If it went, the earth and the remains of her kitchen would come down, and this cellar would be their grave. No, she said, this time aloud. No, you will not. She searched the small space. A fence post, solid oak, one she had been meaning to sink, was leaning in the corner. It was too tall. She grabbed a small hand axe. Bracing the post against the wall, she began to chop at the end. The small, cramped impacts echoing like gunshots. It was clumsy, desperate work. The beam groaned again, and more dirt fell, showering her hair. She finally hacked the post to size. She dragged it over, ignoring the water now swirling around her ankles. She wedged one end against the dirt floor and, with all her strength, shoved the other end up, until it fit snugly under the cracking beam. It held. The groaning stopped. She collapsed against the wall, her lungs burning. The cellar was dark, wet, and smelled of fear, but it was holding. She must have drifted into a state of shock, or perhaps sleep. She was awakened by a sound, a whisper. She lifted her head. The candle was nearly gone. A guttering stump. The man's eyes were open. They were dark, unfocused, and stared past her, at the shaking cellar door. He was delirious with fever and the head wound. He tried to lift his head, failed. His lips moved, forming a single word. It was soft, a breath. Kinlani. Liza leaned closer. What did you say? He looked at her then. His gaze traveled over her face, over the puckered skin of her scar, but there was no recognition in his eyes, no judgment, only confusion. "Kinlani," he whispered again, and then his eyes rolled back, and he was gone again, back into unconsciousness. Liza did not know the word, but the sound of it stayed with her, a strange comfort in the raging dark. The storm howled for hours. It seemed to go on for a lifetime, but finally, slowly, the terrifying, grinding roar faded. The vibration lessened. The wind became a howl again, then a moan, and then, at last, a dreadful, echoing silence. Dawn. The silence was heavier, more frightening than the storm had been. Liza waited. She waited until the first thin light of a gray morning found its way through the cracks in the cellar door. She moved the brace she had fashioned for the trap door. It was blocked. She put her shoulder to it and shoved. It gave, scraping against a weight of rubble. She pushed it open and climbed out. She did not recognize her world. The sky was a pale, washed out, sickly yellow. The air was cold. Her house was wounded. The kitchen was gone, its walls blown away, leaving only the floorboards and the open hole of the cellar. The rest of the small adobe structure was standing, but the roof was damaged. The barn was not there. It was gone. Where it had stood, there was only a field of splinters, and her horses. She scanned the horizon, her heart a cold stone. No sign of them. They were gone, fled, or she could not let her mind go there. The fences were down, every single one. The land was scoured, stripped bare, as if a giant hand had scraped it clean. She was ruined. She stood there, shivering in the cold morning air, a lone figure in a landscape of destruction. Then she remembered the man. She did not know what she had to do. She walked, numb, toward the west fence line, to the spot where she had found him. The ground was a slurry of mud. The wind had stripped the topsoil, revealing the wet clay beneath. And in the clay, there were marks. Footprints, his moccasins, sliding in the mud. But there were others. The deep, sharp crescents of shod horses. At least 3 of them. They had not been washed away. They were fresh, entangled in the broken wire of the fence. The wire he had been trying to get under was a small, bright object. Liza bent and pulled it free. It was the broken half of an arrow. The shaft was painted, and the fletchings, the feathers, were bound in a pattern she had never seen before. She looked from the tracks to the broken arrow, and then back toward her ruined house, where the Apache warrior lay unconscious in her cellar. He had not been caught in the storm by accident. He had been running from someone. He was being hunted, and now, whoever was hunting him, they would see the tracks. They would see where they led. They led directly to her. He was awake. When Liza climbed back down into the cellar, the candle stub long dead, the man's eyes were open. He was not delirious. He was clear, and he was watching her, his gaze sharp and assessing. She had brought water in a tin cup. She offered it. He pushed himself up on one elbow, his body wincing in protest. The makeshift burlap bandage was stiff with dried blood. He took the cup, his hand steady, and drank slowly. He drained it and handed it back. "The storm," he said. His voice was a low rasp. "It is over." "It is," Liza said. She stood awkwardly, not used to sharing this small space. "It took the barn and the kitchen." He looked up, at the heavy beams of the cellar roof, at the plank floor of the kitchen above. This held. You braced it. He nodded at the fence post she had jammed under the cracking tie. "It held," she agreed. "I found you at the west fence line. You were unconscious. You were being hunted." She held out the broken arrow. His eyes fixed on it, and his face hardened. He did not take it. "Who are you?" Liza asked. Her voice was plain, direct. He paused, testing his own memory. "I am called Tazin." "Tazin," she repeated. "What does it mean?" A flicker of something, maybe irony, crossed his face. "It means still wind, the quiet after the storm passes." "What happened to you before the storm?" He closed his eyes. He struggled, reaching for memories that were torn and scattered, like the splinters of her barn. "I remember a fire, not the storm, before, the smell of burning pine, and gunshots. Close, not a rifle, a pistol, several." He touched the gash on his temple, his fingers exploring the crude bandage. "They hit me. I ran. The horses, they were almost on me when the sky turned green." "Who?" Liza pressed. "I do not know," he said, and she believed him. The memory was broken. They wore hats, broad hats, that is all. Liza absorbed this. Hunted, a fire, gunfire. It was more trouble than she had ever known. "You cannot stay in the cellar," she said. "The kitchen is gone. This hole is open to the sky." She helped him up the steps. He was weak, but he could stand. The daylight made him squint. He looked around at the desolation, at the scoured earth and the skeleton of her kitchen. He saw the place where the barn had been, and his gaze was knowing. He understood what she had lost. Then he looked at her. He saw the old, pale scar tissue that pulled at her cheek. He looked at it, then met her eyes. He said nothing. He just looked. Liza, accustomed to the flinch, the quick turning away, the pity, or the revulsion, found herself holding her breath. He just looked, and it was the first time in a decade she had felt seen, like the scar was just part of the landscape of her face, no different than her nose or her chin. The sound of riders broke the moment. Liza's head snapped toward the ridge. 3 men on horseback, picking their way through the debris. She knew the horses. She knew the men. It was Hank, Voss's foreman, a big man with a cruel mouth, and 2 of his hands, one wiry and mean, the other just a boy, nervous. "In here," she hissed, pointing to the small, intact grain shed, 20 feet away. "Behind the sacks, now!" Tazin did not argue. He moved with a speed that surprised her, slipping into the dark shed just as the riders entered her yard. Liza picked up a piece of broken lumber, as if she had been salvaging it. She leaned on it, waiting. "Mornin', Liza," Hank called out. He did not sound friendly. His eyes raked over the damage, a cold assessment. "Hank," she replied. "Mr. Voss was concerned," Hank said, the lie tasting like dust in the air. "Figured the storm might have caused you some trouble with your collateral." "It caused trouble," Liza said flatly. The wiry man, whose name was Ames, dismounted. He walked around, kicking at the rubble. "Looks like it caused you a heap of trouble. Liza, barn's clean gone. Horses with it. I see." He ambled over to the open cellar. This held up, though. Liza's stomach went cold. Ames knelt by the muddy lip of the cellar opening. "Got company?" he asked, too casually. "What are you talking about?" Liza said, her voice tight. "Tracks," Ames said, grinning. "Mocassins, a man's tracks, right here, coming out, and I seen shod hoof prints and a broke arrow down by the west fence. Looked like a hunting party." Hank's voice became steel. "We're just asking. Liza, Mr. Voss, he's a councilman. He's got to uphold the law, and the law in this territory is real clear about folks harboring renegades." He leaned forward on his saddle horn. "Giving aid to a hostile Apache, that's a federal crime. Folks get real upset. The Army takes that real personal. A person could lose their land, everything." Liza forced a cold, hard laugh. "Tracks after that wind took my barn. Hank, I think it could take a few footprints. You're seeing ghosts." Hank was not convinced. He swung his leg over the saddle. "Just the same, we'll take a look. Mr. Voss, he likes us to be thorough." He started to walk toward the cellar. "He's sick," Liza burst out. The words were sharp, desperate. Hank stopped, his hand on his pistol. "Who's sick?" "My cousin," Liza said. The lie felt clumsy on her tongue. From back east. He's got a lung fever. Bad. Came in just before the storm. He's sleeping. Down in the root cellar. It was the only safe place. She forced a dry, hacking cough into her sleeve. I'd appreciate you not waking him, or catching what he's got. The three men looked at one another. Lung fever, consumption, words that carried as much weight as a bullet. Hank took an involuntary step back. Ames wiped his grinning face, his expression suddenly sober. A cousin, Hank said, his eyes narrowing, his gaze lingering on her scar as if trying to measure the truth of her. Never knew you had family. Liza. There's a lot you do not know. Hank, she said, meeting his gaze. They hesitated. The lie was thin as water, but the fear of the sickness was real. They did not want to go into that damp, dark hole. You tell Mr. Voss I'll be in town to talk about the note as soon as I've salvaged what's left, Liza said, turning her back on them, an act of dismissal. Hank stood there for a long moment. See that you do, he said finally, his voice full of gravel. He climbed back onto his horse. Mr. Voss is a patient man, Liza, but his patience is wearing thin as that barn roof of yours. Liza did not watch them go. She stood, her knuckles white on the broken piece of wood, until the sound of their horses faded. Her entire body was shaking. They knew. They did not believe her. They would be back. That night, she sat in her one remaining room, the part of the house the storm had only wounded, not killed. The cavalry pistol her father had left her was on the table, cleaned and loaded. She was terrified. Voss wanted her land, she knew that. Now, she had given him the perfect excuse to take it. All he had to do was prove she was harboring an Apache. He could have her jailed. He could have the land seized. And the other men, the men who had been hunting Tazin, they were still out there. They would be back, too. It would be so simple. She could go to the grain shed, give the man the last of her water, and point him toward the Chiricahuas. Tell him to run. It was not her fight. He was not her kin. He was, by every law the white men had written, her enemy. But she could not. She remembered the feeling of pulling his dead weight from the fence line. She remembered the sound of the word Kinlani. And she remembered the way he had looked at her, his eyes clear, not seeing a monster or a curse or an outcast, just a person. She had saved his life. She could not, she realized with a cold, solid certainty, be the one to hand him over. She was in this, whatever it cost, she was in this. The next day, she went to the shed. Tazin was feverish. The head wound was inflamed. His deerskin shirt was stiff with mud and dried blood. You need to clean that, she said, her voice rough. It will fester. He nodded, his movement slow. He tried to unlace the shirt, but his fingers were clumsy, shaking with fever. He fumbled and grimaced. Liza knelt in the dust of the grain shed. Hold still, she said. It was like tending a spooked horse. She untied the leather laces, her fingers brushing the warm skin of his chest. She pulled the heavy shirt off his shoulders. As it came free, a sheath on his belt was jostled. The knife inside slid free. Liza caught it before it hit the ground. It was not a cavalry blade, or a settlement knife. The handle was bone, worn smooth. Carved deep into it was a jagged, unmistakable symbol, a lightning bolt, a thunder mark. Tied to the sheath with a thin leather thong was a single, perfect, red-tailed hawk feather. Liza stared at it. The hawk, the drums, the omen. She looked from the knife to his face. He was watching her, his eyes clouded with fever but still aware. I'll wash this, she said, her voice quieter now, holding the heavy shirt. She hesitated, then closed her hand around the knife and sheath. I will keep this safe. For now. He did not protest. He just nodded, a small, trusting gesture, and lay back against the grain sacks, shivering. For 2 days, the fever raged. Liza brought him water and a thin broth she made from jerky. She washed his shirt by the well and hung it to dry, the thunder knife and its feather hidden deep in her house. On the third day, the fever broke. She came to the shed to find him sitting up, his eyes clear. He was weak, but the stillness was gone. Later that afternoon, she was outside, struggling. She was trying to reset one of the main fence posts, the one that held the gate to her non-existent corral. The ground was hard, and she was using a heavy tamping bar, but she did not have the weight. The post wobbled, loose in the hole. Tazin came out of the shed. He moved silently, his bare feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He watched her for a moment. She ignored him, grunting with effort, her frustration mounting. He turned and walked to the dry, rocky creek bed where a few skeletal willows grew. He cut a forked branch, trimmed it, and returned. He held the two forks in his hands, palms up, the single stem pointing forward. Liza stopped, wiping sweat and dirt from her face. "What are you doing? I need help, not witching." He did not answer. He began to walk. He moved across her yard, his eyes half closed, his feet sure. He was not walking randomly. He was following something she could not see. He walked 30 yards from the ruined house, to a spot she had only ever seen as a patch of stubborn greasewood. Suddenly, the tip of the willow branch dove toward the earth. It pulled so hard the bark peeled back in his grip. He stopped. He pressed his heel into the dirt, making a mark. "Here," he said. "Here what?" Liza said, exasperated. "Water," he said, "not deep." Liza stared. "That's impossible. My well is 50 feet deep and dry half the summer. This is high ground." "The ground speaks," he said simply. "You have to listen." He found her shovel, the one she had left by the cellar hole. His wound still pained him. She could see it in the tightness of his jaw. But he sank the shovel into the hard-baked earth. "You're wasting your strength," she said. "He just kept digging." Liza let out a sigh, picked up her own shovel, and walked to the spot. "Fine, but when we hit bedrock, I'm telling you I told you so." They dug. The work was hard, but now there were two of them. They dug for an hour. At 6 feet, the pale dirt turned dark and cool. At 7 feet, it was damp, clinging to the shovels. At 8 feet, water, clear and cold, began to weep from the side of the hole and pool at the bottom. Liza dropped her shovel. She knelt, staring. She dipped her hand into the small, growing puddle. It was real, cold, sweet. She looked at Tazin. He was leaning on his shovel, breathing hard. But his eyes were satisfied. He had not just brought trouble. He had brought life. He understood this land in a way she, who had been born on it, never had. A small, strange seed of trust, tiny but alive, began to sprout in the dry ground of her fear. The next day, a single rider came, Marshal Cobb. He sat his polished horse, his silver badge bright, his gaze taking in the new, muddy hole and the pile of salvaged lumber. Tazin was, thankfully, hidden back in the shed. "Miss Boone?" Cobb said. His voice was all smooth, false politeness. "Marshal," she replied. "I heard you had quite the time in the storm," he said. "We all did." Cobb's eyes, pale and cold, sharpened. Liza felt the slip. Me and the land. He dismounted, walking closer, his boots stirring the dust. "Hank and the boys mentioned you might have a relative taken sick." "My cousin," Liza said, her voice hard. "That's funny," Cobb said, stroking his neat mustache. "I had a word with the station master in town. No one by your name, or any name, came in on the last 3 trains looking for you." "He rode," Liza said. "Ah," Cobb nodded, but he was not smiling. "Liza, I'm going to give you some advice, as a concerned member of this community." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We live by the law in this territory. We are a civilized people, harboring natives, especially natives who are running from something, is a fast way to lose everything you hold dear. The army does not take kindly to it. And Mr. Voss, as a councilman, he's a stickler for the law. Are you accusing me of something, Marshal? I am offering guidance, Cobb said softly. If you were to find someone on your property, someone who does not belong, the smart thing, the legal thing, would be to ride into town and tell me, immediately, before anyone else gets wind of it. It would show cooperation. In light of that cooperation, Mr. Voss might even be inclined to be flexible on that little note of yours. The bribe, the threat, all wrapped in the law. I will remember that, Marshal, Liza said, her voice empty. See that you do. He remounted, looked at a ruined ranch, and shook his head. It's a hard life for a woman alone. You make it harder than it needs to be. He turned his horse and rode away. That evening, she brought food to the grain shed. Tazin was carving a small piece of wood with her father's whittling knife. He looked up when she entered. The marshal was here, she said. He nodded. He had heard. They know, she said. They do not believe my lie. They are offering me a deal. They said if I give you up, they will let me keep my land. He stopped carving. He looked at her. He did not plead. He did not bargain. He just waited, his face calm, giving her the dignity of the choice. Liza looked at the wood shavings, at his strong, scarred hands. She thought of the new well, a dark circle of hope in the twilight. She thought of Hank, and Cobb, and Voss. They call me the ugliest girl in the county, she said, her voice low, the words tasting like ash. They have for 10 years. They treat me like I'm a stray dog or a curse. That marshal, that man Voss, they think they can buy me with my own land. They think I'm just as rotten and hollow as they are. She straightened, the fear still a cold knot inside her. But now something else was there beside it, a hard, cold, defiant anger. You found water, she said. That is more than any of them have ever done. She turned to leave the shed. We will need to be smarter. They will be back, and not just for the debt. She was at the door when he spoke, his voice quiet. You are not ugly. Liza stopped, her back to him. The scar, he said, his voice certain. It is a weather mark. It shows you survived the fire. She closed her eyes. She had been called freak, monster, cursed. She had never, not once, been called a survivor. He did not see her as ugly. He saw her as strong. Get some rest, she said, her voice thick. There's work to do tomorrow. She walked out of the grain shed and into the dusk, choosing her side. She had chosen the human being over the prejudice, the survivor over the law. She knew, deep in her bones, this choice would cost her everything, or save the only thing that mattered. They established a new, unspoken set of rules. It was a compact of mutual survival, written in the shared language of desperation. The grain shed was his territory. The wounded house was hers. Liza brought him food, what little she had, and medicine, a poultice of crushed comfrey leaf for his head, which was healing slowly, the skin knitting angrily. Tazin, in return, brought his strength. He did not wait to be asked. He saw the gaping hole where the kitchen roof had been, open to the sky, and he began to salvage. He worked with a quiet, focused economy of motion. He pulled solid planks from the wreckage of the barn, sighting down them for straightness, discarding the split ones. He salvaged nails, straightening them one by one with a rock and her father's hammer. Liza watched him. He moved like a man who understood how things were put together, and how they came apart. As she handed him a heavy, salvaged beam, her hand, calloused and broad from work, brushed his was just as rough, scarred in different ways. Her hands were the one part of herself she had always been proud of. They were capable. They were strong. Her father, before the whiskey had sanded him down to nothing, had taught her to use them. He had been a cavalryman, but he had loved books and the smell of horses more than the bugle. He taught her to read, to set a fence post, to birth a calf. Her mother was a ghost, a half-remembered scent of lavender and a persistent, dry cough that had stolen her breath one winter when Liza was 6. After that, her father's sadness had soured, curdling into a dependence on the bottle. He was not a cruel man, not in the way of fists, but in the way of absence. He had disappeared into himself long before he was buried in the ground. When Liza was 12, the night of the fire, he had been in town, lost in the hazy fellowship of the saloon. She had woken to the smell of smoke and the screaming of the horses. She had saved them, all 3. She ran back into the collapsing inferno for the last one, a filly, and a burning rafter had fallen, its fiery arm grazing her face as she dove clear. She had carried the filly out, her own cheek smoking. The townspeople, when they finally arrived, looked at the ruin, at her father staggering home at dawn, and at her. They looked at her face. The word ugly was whispered that day, and it had never stopped. It was easier to say ugly than brave. It was easier to blame the girl with the mark than the father with the bottle. For 10 years, that word had been her armor. She had wrapped herself in it. She spoke plainly because she had no prettiness to sweeten her words. She worked harder than any man because her hands were the only part of her that could not be criticized. She kept her gaze level because to look away was to admit shame. But the armor was also a cage. It kept everyone out. And in the dark, silent hours, it still ached, a deep, cold wound that never healed. She handed Tazin the hammer. He was fixing the roof, and she had to go to town. The flour sack was empty. The small tin of coffee, empty. The salt, empty. "It is a trap," Tazin said, his voice flat. He did not look up from his work. "The man, Cobb, he will be waiting." "We cannot eat rocks," Liza replied, her voice just as flat. "And the mule is hungry." The storm had spared her one old mule, who had huddled in a low wash and survived. She rode the mule into Dry River. The town felt different. The air, usually filled with the sounds of the smithy and idle talk, was still. It was the quiet of a snake coiled on a hot rock. When she walked into the general store, the half-dozen men inside stopped talking. It was not the usual pause, the one that preceded a snicker. This was a hostile, assessing silence. Mr. Harris, the proprietor, a small man who usually fluttered with nervous energy, would not meet her eyes. He weighed her flour, his hands visibly shaking. "That will be all." "Liza," he whispered, as if the walls were listening. "I need salt and coffee." "Liza," he licked his lips. "People are talking, bad talk." "They are always talking, Mr. Harris," she said, her voice too loud in the dead air. "No, this is different. Hank, from the Voss Ranch. He has been telling stories." "What stories?" "About the reservation supply wagon, the one that was robbed and burned up in the pass. During the storm, they are saying it was Apache. They are saying it was him, the one they called Tazin." Liza's blood went cold. "I know nothing about any wagon train." "They say you know him," Harris whispered, shoving her small package across the counter. "They say you are hiding him." Liza grabbed the sack. Folks should be careful what they say. As she stepped out onto the boardwalk, she saw it, nailed to the post outside Marshal Cobb's office. A new poster, the ink still fresh. It offered a reward, $100, for the capture alive of an Apache male, known as Tazin, wanted for questioning in the armed robbery and destruction of federal property. It was signed, in a bold, arrogant hand, by Clayton Voss, county councilman. Voss was not just spreading rumors. He was using his power. He was legalizing a hunt. He was painting a target on her back. She rode the mule hard, the fear a bitter taste in her mouth. She stormed into the grain shed where Tazin was sorting salvaged wood. "A wagon train," she said, throwing the flour sack onto a crate. "They say you robbed a supply wagon, burned it. They have put a price on your head, $100. Tazin stopped his work. He stood slowly. "A wagon train robbed." The words seemed to jolt something in him. He walked to the door of the shed, staring at the distant mountains, his hand going to his healing temple. "The fire," he said, his voice distant. "The gunfire I told you I remembered. It was not pine burning, it was bacon, tallow, and canvas." He turned to her, his eyes suddenly, fiercely alive. "I was not robbing. I was watching. I was trailing them. The men who hit me." "What men?" "The men with the hats. They were not Apache. They were white men. They were the ones robbing the wagon. They set the fire. I tried to stop them to free the mules and they shot at me. One of them hit me." He looked at his hands. "I ran. They followed. Then the storm hit." He looked at her, the pieces of his broken memory clicking into place. "They had sacks, many sacks. They were not taking them. They were moving them, hiding them. I saw where, before they saw me, a dry wash, under an overhang. A cache." "Where?" Liza asked. 2 miles north, near the canyon. I can find it." He looked at her, his jaw set, and I saw a mark on the sacks, a circle, with a V inside it. Liza felt the world tilt, the Circle 5, the Voss Ranch brand. "Voss," she breathed. "He robbed the wagon, but it was supplies for the reservation, federal property." "He robbed it," Tazin said, "and he is using me, my people, as the excuse. He put my name on that paper." "He wants your name," Liza said, "but he wants my land, and he is using you to get it." They had to go. It was a terrible risk, leaving the ranch, but the proof, if it existed, was in that canyon. They left the next morning, before dawn. Liza rode the mule. Tazin walked, moving with a tireless, ground-eating stride that the mule struggled to match. He moved like a shadow, his eyes constantly scanning the ridges, reading the land. They traveled through a maze of arroyos and canyons, the red rock walls rising around them. Tazin led her to a place she had never known, a narrow split in the rock, almost invisible. They were following a thin, seasonal trickle of water that seeped from the canyon wall. Tazin stopped. He held up his hand. Liza froze, listening. The only sound was the buzz of a fly and the drip of water. Then she heard it, a small, thin sound, a whimper. It was not an animal. Tazin moved toward a tangle of mesquite. He parted the thorny branches. Huddled in the dirt beneath was a child, a small boy, no more than 5 years old, his cotton clothes torn, his face streaked with tears and dust. He was Mexican. He looked up at them, his dark eyes wide with terror. Liza slid off the mule, holding her hands out. "It is all right," she said softly. "No te no hachimos dano. We mean no harm." She offered her canteen. The boy drank, his small body shaking. "Mama," he cried, his voice breaking. "Donde está mi mama?" Liza's Spanish was rough, learned from traders and ranch hands. "Your mother, where is she?" The boy pointed vaguely back the way he had come, his story tumbling out in a frantic, sobbing mix of Spanish and terror. They were traveling, with a cart, to meet his uncle. And the bad men came. Hombres malos. What men? Liza knelt in the dust, her heart aching. "The man," the boy whispered, his eyes huge. "The man with the white hat, el sombrero blanco. He led them. They took my mother." "Voss," Liza whispered, looking at Tazin. Clayton Voss was famous for his fine, white planter's hat. Tazin's face was grim. He scanned the ground. "They came this way, but the tracks are scattered. The boy is lost." They could not leave him. The cache, the proof, would have to wait. They took the boy, whose name was Mateo, back to the ranch. He was limp with exhaustion and fear, and fell asleep almost instantly in Liza's own narrow bed, his small hand clutching her blanket. Liza sat at her table, watching the small rise and fall of his chest. Tazin was at the door, watching the twilight, his body a tense silhouette, He led them, Liza said. Voss, he took the boy's mother. He is a man who takes, Tazin said. He takes land, he takes supplies, he takes people, and he blames the Apache. Liza looked at Tazin, his profile stark against the bruised sky. She watched him as he turned from the door and knelt by the bed, gently pulling the blanket over the boy's shoulder. His large, rough hands, the hands that could straighten a nail or read a willow branch, were surprisingly gentle. Liza realized, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, what was happening. She was accustomed to being looked at, the stare, the glance, the quick, pitying look away. She was defined by her scar, but Tazin, he did not look at her. He watched her. He watched her hands as she salvaged wood. He watched her eyes as she spoke. He saw the things she did. He saw her competence. He saw her strength. He was not looking at the ugly girl. He was looking at Liza. The armor she had worn for 10 years, the heavy, cold shield, suddenly felt useless and heavy. Later, after the boy was fed and sleeping again, they sat outside. The air was cool and clean. The tension was a wire stretched tight between them. But for this one moment, the danger felt held at bay by the vast, starry sky. Tazin began to hum. It was a low, rhythmic chant, and he tapped his foot on the hard-packed earth. 1, 2, 3. What is that? Liza asked, her voice quiet. A direction song, he said. For when you are lost. My grandfather taught me. You sing to the earth. You ask where you are, and she answers. He showed her the beat, a simple, strong rhythm. Liza tried to copy it with her heavy boot. It felt clumsy. She laughed, a short, rusty sound she rarely used. I do not think the earth listens to me. It does, he said, his voice certain. It listened when you dug for the well. You used a shovel instead of a song. A warmth, unfamiliar and deep, spread through her chest. She went inside and brought out her father's Bible, the only book the storm had not ruined. She found a piece of charcoal from the fire. You write, he stated, seeing the book. My father taught me. She opened to the blank pages in the back. Carefully, she wrote his name, T-A-H-Z-I-N. This is you, she said, pointing to the letters. He traced them with his finger. His people had no alphabet. He knew some English letters, from signs, from wanted posters, but not their names. T, she said, pointing. Eich. He repeated them. His mind was sharp, his tongue quick. He learned them as if he were memorizing a trail. It was a fair trade, a song for a name. The attack came 2 nights later. Liza woke to a different smell. Not wood smoke, grass smoke. She bolted from her cot. Outside, the night was orange. The entire eastern pasture, the last patch of good grazing she owned, was a wall of fire. The wind was fanning it, pushing it straight toward the house and the grain shed. Voss, she spat, the word a curse. She had 3 head of cattle, survivors of the storm, huddled in the one small shed that still stood. They were bellowing, the sound of pure panic. We lose the grass, we lose them, she cried. We lose everything. Tazin was already moving. He was not looking at the fire. He was tasting the wind. He grabbed a heavy horse blanket, soaked it at the new, miraculous well. The cattle, he shouted over the roar. Get them out. Drive them south toward the creek bed now. Liza ran, throwing open the shed gate. The terrified animals bolted, but in the wrong direction, blinded by panic, running straight toward the wall of flame. Tazin did not run at them. He ran in a wide, fast circle around them, the wet blanket flapping. He was not shouting. He was moving, using the blanket to create a wall of smoke, a draft. He was not fighting the fire. He was not fighting the wind. He was using them. He created a current, a backdraft, a channel in the air itself. He turned the animal's own fear, funneling them into the one safe corridor, downwind, away from the flames, toward the sanctuary of the dry creek bed. Liza watched, stunned. He moved like something wild, a creature of the wind and the fire, anticipating its every move, turning its strength against itself. The fire roared past, consuming the dry grass, the flames licking the air where the shed had been moments before. The pasture was gone, a vast, blackened scar under the moon. But the house was safe. The grain shed was safe. The animals were safe. Tazin walked back, his face black with soot, his chest heaving. His eyes, in the flickering orange light, were bright and fierce. He had fought nature with nature. Liza stood, her heart hammering. The pasture was gone. Voss had made his move. This was the first trap. The next, she knew, would be worse. The ashes of the pasture were still warm, a black velvet scar on the land. Liza Boone stood on her porch, looking at the destruction. Clayton Voss had drawn his line, not with a fence, but with fire. The message was clear. "He knows we are here," Tazin said. He had been silent for a long time, watching the smoke from afar off. Undiscovered fire, the one inside his own memory. "The cache, the supplies he stole, we must find it. It is the only way." The child, Mateo, was with them now. He was a small, silent shadow, clinging to Liza's hand, his eyes huge and haunted. He was a witness. He was a victim, and he could not be left alone. They set out again, this time with a grim purpose. Liza rode her mule, with Mateo seated in front of her. Tazin moved on foot, his long, silent stride tireless, his eyes reading the earth. He led them north, into the broken, high-walled country of Dry Knife Canyon. It was a place of high, red walls, split and shattered by ancient forces. He followed no trail Liza could see, only the subtle language of shifted pebbles, broken branches, and the memory of a desperate flight. He stopped at a place that looked like nothing, a sheer wall of rock, but he pushed aside a heavy curtain of sun-dried brush, revealing a dark split in the stone, an opening no wider than a horse. "Here," he said. Liza dismounted. Lifting Mateo down, she pulled her father's pistol from her belt. The air inside was cold, still, and smelled of dust, canvas, and something else, something chemical. Tazin struck a match. The small flame illuminated a large cave. It was filled, piled high, with heavy canvas sacks. On each, stenciled in black, was the unmistakable brand of the circle fire. Liza's heart hammered. This is it. But Tazin was already moving deeper. "It is more than flour," he said. He sliced open a sack with his knife. It was not flour. It was not bacon. It was black. Gunpowder. Liza moved to a long, wooden crate. She found a small pry bar in her saddlebag and forced the lid. The wood groaned and split. Inside, nestled in grease, were rifles. Not hunting rifles. They were new, army issue. "He is not just a thief," Liza whispered, the words catching in her dry throat. "He is running guns. He robbed the federal wagon to sell weapons." "To anyone who pays," Tazin said, his voice grim. He was standing in front of a heavy, metal strongbox, bolted shut. The lock had been damaged, hacked at with a heavy blade, but it had held. "He tried to get in here," Liza said. "No," Tazin said, his hand going to his temple, the memory still painful. "I did." Before he could explain, a sound echoed from the canyon mouth, the scrape of a boot on rock. A man cleared his throat. Well, finders keepers, I suppose." Liza spun, leveling the pistol. Marshal Cobb stood in the mouth of the cave, the bright sunlight at his back making him a black silhouette. He was not alone. 2 deputies, men she recognized, stood behind him. "Marshal," Liza said, her voice shaking, but her hand steady on the gun. "Thank God. We found it. It is Voss. He is running guns. Here is the proof. Put the pistol down. Miss Boone, Cobb said, his voice flat, all politeness gone. He stepped into the cave, his eyes not surprised, only cold. You are interfering with an official investigation. This is the investigation, Liza insisted. My investigation. Cobb snapped. He walked past her, his gaze sweeping over the rifles, the powder, the sacks. Mr. Voss reported some discrepancies in his own inventory. Now I see where his stolen goods have ended up. His goods. Liza was stunned. These are from the reservation wagon, the one he robbed. That is a serious accusation, Miss Boone, Cobb said smoothly. He nodded to his deputies. You two, secure the area. This is all evidence. He walked to the strongbox, the one Tarzan had looked at. He produced a key from his own vest pocket and opened it. Inside, Liza saw ledgers and bundles of paper. Cobb took them, leafing through one, his expression satisfied. He tucked them inside his coat. What are you doing? Liza demanded. Securing the evidence, Cobb said. He picked up a lantern from a hook. Then he looked at a barrel in the corner, one Liza had not noticed. He tipped it with his boot, a dark, pungent fluid. Kerosene, spilled out, soaking the dirt floor, pooling around the gunpowder sacks. Marshal, no. An accident, Cobb said, his pale eyes shining in the gloom. A terrible fire hazard. This place at best to clean it up. He struck a match. No, Tarzan yelled, surging forward. One of the deputies raised his rifle, pressing the muzzle to Tarzan's chest. Stay put, Apache. Cobb tossed the match onto the kerosene. The world erupted in a whoosh of yellow flame. The fire spread instantly, climbing the canvas sacks, the gunpowder catching with bright, sizzling pops. You are burning it, Liza screamed. You are burning the proof. I am containing a threat, Miss Boone, Cobb said, backing toward the entrance, his face lit by the inferno. Now, I am placing you both under arrest, him for the robbery, and you for harboring a fugitive. You will tell that to Sister May. The voice came from the canyon, clear and cold as iron. Cobb spun around. A woman sat on a sturdy brown mule at the cave's entrance, the firelight dancing in her spectacles. She was dressed in the simple, dark gray habit of a lay sister, her face lined with sun and conviction. Beside her mule stood a Mexican woman, her face swollen with tears. Sister May, Cobb stammered, his composure cracking for the first time. What are you doing here? I am looking for this woman, Sister May said, gesturing to Mateo's mother. She was found wandering by my mission. Her cart burned, her child stolen. She said the men who did it were led by a man in a white hat. Her son, there he is. Mateo, who had been hiding behind Liza, saw his mother. Mama, he shrieked, running past the deputies, past the fire, into her arms. Sister May dismounted, her eyes missing nothing. She saw the Circle 5 on the burning sacks. She saw the rifles, and she saw the ledgers in Cobb's coat. I run the refugee camp at the old mission. Marshal, she said, her voice sharp. I am the appointed relief agent for this district. I was supposed to receive those supplies. I have the manifest. She held up a worn, leather-bound logbook. Every crate, every number. I imagine they would match the numbers on those crates you are so diligently destroying. Cobb was trapped. The fire roared, eating his cover. This is a dangerous scene, sister, he blustered. I must ask you to leave. I am not leaving, Sister May said. I am a witness to arson, to destruction of federal property, and, I suspect, to your complicity, Marshal. Cobb's face was pale with rage. He was in front of a federal agent, however unofficial, and a child, and a victim. He could not shoot his way out. This investigation is over, he snarled. Get out, all of you. This canyon is closed. He and his deputies mounted, riding hard out of the canyon, leaving Liza, Tazin, and the small, reunited family to stare at the pillar of black smoke rising into the sky. The ride back was tense. Sister May had taken Mateo and his mother to the safety of her mission. Liza and Tazin were alone. They knew Cobb was not finished. He was implicated. He was desperate. They were a mile from the ranch when Tazin reined in the mule. He slid off, listening. Riders, he said. Fast. Not from the town, from the north. Voss's land. Liza's blood ran cold. They are coming for us. No, Tazin said, his eyes on the trail that led to the mission. They are not coming for us. They are going for the witness. For the boy. Voss was cleaning up his mess. Tazin did not hesitate. He ran. Not toward the ranch, but taking a shortcut. A goat path up the side of the arroyo. Get the mule to the mission, bar the door. I will meet you there. Liza did not argue. She kicked the mule, her heart pounding. She had to warn Sister May. She heard the gunshots echo in the canyons behind her. 2, 3, then a fourth. She did not look back. She reached the mission, a crumbling adobe church, and hammered on the heavy oak door. Sister, it is Liza, bolt the doors, they are coming. She tumbled inside, and the heavy bar dropped into place just as a half-dozen riders, Hank among them, thundered into the mission courtyard. They yelled. They kicked the door, but it was old, thick wood. It held. Liza and Sister May huddled in the small chapel, with Mateo and his mother, listening to the curses and threats from outside. After an hour, the men gave up. They rode away, firing their guns in the air in frustration. Liza waited until the sound was long gone. Then she waited another hour. Darkness fell. A cold, high desert rain began to fall. He was not back. He will be, Sister May said, her voice calm. That one he is not easy to catch. Liza left, slipping out a small back gate. She ran, stumbling in the mud in the dark, all the way back to her ranch. The house was empty. The grain shed was empty. The rain hammered down. She lit a lantern, her hands shaking, and sat at her table, the cavalry pistol in front of her. She waited. Hours later, the door creaked open. Tazin stood there, framed in the doorway, soaked to the skin, his face pale. He was clutching his left shoulder. His shirt was black with blood. He stumbled inside and collapsed onto her cot. The grain shed, it was drier. She helped him. His arm draped over her, his weight heavy. She got him inside, onto a pile of dry sacks. The rain hammered on the wooden roof, a deafening, frantic drumbeat. The lantern cast wild, dancing shadows. The shed smelled of damp wood, of rain, and of him. Let me see, she said. He pulled the torn, wet shirt away. A bullet had ripped through the muscle of his shoulder. It was ugly, a ragged tear, bleeding freely. She ran back to the house, grabbed her father's sewing kit, the whiskey bottle he had left, and clean rags. Back in the shed, she knelt beside him. This will hurt. I know, he said, his jaw set. She poured the whiskey onto the wound. He hissed, his entire body going rigid, but he made no other sound. She took the needle, threaded it with a piece of her own thread. Her hands, they were shaking. She could not make the first stitch. She was so afraid, not of the blood. She had stitched cattle. She had stitched her own hand once. She was terrified. She was terrified of the world that had done this, of the men who were still out there, of the fact that this man, who had found her water and called her strong, was bleeding in her shed. She was terrified of losing him. Your hands, he said, his voice a low rasp. I know, she whispered, angry at herself. I cannot seem... You are afraid, he said. Yes, she admitted, meeting his eyes in the wild lantern light. Of them, of this, of you. He watched her, his gaze steady, patient. He raised his good hand, the right one. He moved it slowly. He did not touch the wound. He did not touch her hands. He touched her face. His fingers, rough from work, light as a breath, traced the puckered, pale line of her scar, from her temple, down her cheek, to her jaw. She flinched, her body's built in response. But his hand was gentle. It was not a touch of pity. It was not a touch of curiosity. It was a touch of knowing. "Not ugly," he said, his voice a low whisper that cut through the sound of the rain. "Weathermark, strong." A single, hot tear broke free and rolled down her other cheek. The good one, the wall, the armor, the 10 years of hardness, it all cracked. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Her hands were rock steady. She pushed the needle through his skin. He did not flinch. She made the second stitch, and the third, neat, tight, and strong. She tied off the thread and cut it. It was done. She sat back on her heels, the emotional and physical tension draining from her, leaving her hollow. He was still watching her. With his good arm, he reached for her, pulling her gently toward him. She resisted for a half-second, then leaned in, resting her scarred cheek against his uninjured shoulder. He held her. It was not a lover's embrace. It was the embrace of two survivors, two people who had nothing, huddled together against a storm that was trying to destroy them both. The rain beat on the roof, but inside, there was only the sound of their breathing, a shared warmth, a shared silence. "Cobb burned it all," she whispered against his skin. "He burned the proof." "Not all of it," Tazin said, his voice resonating through her. "He did not burn Sister May's book. He did not burn the boy's memory." He was quiet for a moment. He was holding the thunder-carved knife. He had used it to cut away his shirt. He stared at it. "And he did not burn the strongbox," he said, his voice suddenly sharp with realization. "The fire, it would not touch the metal. But it is locked." Liza said, "And Cobb has the key." "We do not need the key." Tazin said. He held up the knife, the thunder mark catching the light. "The marks on the lock, they were mine. I made them. I was trying to stop them, to open the box when they hit me." He looked at her, his eyes clear and hard. "My knife. The marks on the box, they prove I was there. They prove I was fighting them. That is the truth." They held on to that, a small, hard piece of hope. They would fight with the truth. But Voss had one more weapon, the law. 2 days later, the land office clerk rode out. He did not look her in the eye. He handed her a sealed envelope and rode away quickly. It was an official notice, a summons. A public hearing on her delinquent loan was set for the following week. At the bottom, in Clayton Voss's bold, arrogant script, was a personal note. "Miss Boone," it read. "The offer still stands. Surrender the Apache fugitive to Marshal Cobb, and your note will be forgiven. If not, I will see you in court, and I will take your land." The ultimatum had been delivered. The final battle would not be fought with guns, but in a courtroom. And she had 1 week. The sky gave them 1 day of peace, 1 day of cold, clear air and a pale, watery sun. Then, on the 2nd day, the world turned sick. It began not with wind, but with a color. The light, even at noon, turned a venomous, heavy green. The air grew still, a silence so profound it was louder than any noise. It was the silence of a held breath, the pause before the strike. Liza Boone stood on her ruined porch, her hand on the new well, the one Tazin had found. The water was cold. It was the only thing that felt real. She looked west. A wall of brown, a solid entity that scraped the sky, was rising from the desert floor. It was a dust storm, a haboob, as the old-timers called it, a mile high and moving fast. From the south, she heard a low, distant moan, the sound of a great beast waking. A second storm, a twister. "They will use this," Tazin said. He had come to stand beside her, not close, but sharing the same small space of threatened ground. His wounded shoulder was bound tightly, his movements stiff, but his eyes were clear. "He will not wait for the hearing." Liza agreed, her voice flat. "He will come to finish it." They had spent the day before preparing after the fire. Tazin had taken her to the spot in the canyon, not the cave, but the wash below it, the place where he had first seen the robbers. There, tangled in a mesquite bush, half buried in the mud from the last storm, was a single, heavy canvas sack. It was identical to the ones Cobb had burned. The Circle 5 was dark and clear upon it. It was their only proof, a tangible link. It was hidden now, under the floorboards of her house. The brown wall of the dust storm hit first. It was not like wind. It was like being buried. The world vanished in a suffocating, churning tide of grit. The sun was gone. Noon became midnight. The air was thick, impossible to breathe. The moan from the south grew, becoming a shriek that tore through the deeper roar of the dust. And through the roar, they heard it. Horses, men's voices muffled by the brown haze, calling to one another. "They are here," Liza said, her hand moving to the pistol in her belt. "Get in the house," Tazin commanded. "Bar the door." "I will not. This is my land." "You cannot shoot what you cannot see," he said. "They are blind. We will use that." He moved, not to the house, but to the wreckage of the barn. He grabbed a long, torn piece of canvas, a remnant of a wagon cover. He ran to the one remaining, wobbly line of fence, the posts still standing but the wire gone. He began to weave the canvas through the posts, creating a crude, flapping wall, a wind trap. "Tazin!" she cried, but he was gone. A shadow in the brown gloom. A shot rang out, impossibly close. A bullet whined past her head. "She is by the house!" a voice yelled. It was Hank, the foreman. Liza dove behind the heavy stone well, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could see nothing, just swirling, suffocating dust. "Spread out," another voice bellowed. It was Clayton Voss himself. He had come. "Find them, Cobb. You take the east." "I am a marshal. Voss, not your dog," another voice growled. It was Marshal Cobb. "You are whatever I pay you to be." Voss spat. "Find the Apache, and find the girl. We cannot have witnesses." They were all here. The whole rotten structure of Dry River's power converged on her small, ruined ranch, hidden by the storm. Another shot, this one from a different direction, and then a yell. A man cursed, followed by the sound of a horse rearing in panic. "He is in the wires. He is by the old fence." Tazin. He was using the dust as a shield, moving like a ghost, drawing them toward his trap. Toward the ruined fence line he knew, and they did not. He was pulling them apart, using their blindness. Liza knew she could not just hide. She ran, bent double, from the well to the house. She fumbled under the loose floorboard, her fingers closing on the rough, heavy canvas of the sack. She pulled it out. This was her fight, too. She ran back out into the yard, into the brown chaos. She could just make out the dark shapes of the riders, dismounted now, moving warily, their guns out. "Cobb!" she screamed, her voice raw. "Marshal Cobb!" A shape solidified in front of her. It was the marshal, his face a mask of dust, his eyes wide and angry. "Miss Boone," he snarled. "You are interfering. Stand down." "Here," she cried, and she threw the heavy, folded canvas sack. It landed at his feet, the Circle 5 brand facing up, a dark accusation in the mud. "Here's your proof, Marshal. The proof you tried to burn federal property, stolen by him." She pointed into the gloom where she had last heard the voice of Voss. Cobb stared at the sack. He was trapped. He looked left. He looked right. He could see Voss, Hank, and the others, all turning, their guns now trained on him and Liza. He made his choice. He pulled his revolver. He did not fire at her. He fired into the air, a booming warning shot that was almost swallowed by the wind. "The Apache," he yelled, creating his own diversion. "He is attacking. He is resisting arrest." He lunged past Liza, into the dust, toward the fence line. "Tazin, you are under arrest for destruction of property." Liza ran after him. "He is innocent. You know he is." She saw Tazin then. He was pressed against the flapping canvas wall, his knife in his hand. Hank and another man were closing in on him. Cobb raised his pistol, not at Hank, but at Tazin. "On your knees, hands up." "No!" Liza screamed. She ran, positioning her own body between the marshal and Tazin. You will not murder him!" Cobb stopped. He was face to face with her. He could not shoot her. Not yet. His face, visible in a brief lull in the dust, was a mask of pure, cornered rage. "Get out of my way, girl," he hissed. No. He did not use his pistol. He raised his rifle, and with a short, brutal movement, he slammed the heavy wooden stock into her shoulder. The impact was a bright, sickening explosion of pain. Liza collapsed, the world spinning, the taste of dust and blood in her mouth. She was vaguely aware of Tazin roaring her name, the sound of fury, and the sound of a struggle. "Bind him," Cobb ordered, his voice high and strained. "Bind that savage. He is charged with assaulting an officer." Hands, rough and strong, tied Tazin's wrists. Liza tried to push herself up, but her arm would not obey. The world was brown and gray and filled with pain. "What, in the name of God, is happening here?" The voice was not Voss. It was not Cobb. It was iron. Through the thinning dust, a new group appeared. They were on foot, a strange, bedraggled army. Sister May, her gray habit dark with rain and dirt, led them. Behind her were the faces of the mission, the refugees, Apache women, Mexican families, and poor white homesteaders who had lost their land. They carried no guns. They carried only their presence. Sister May. Cobb stammered, his rifle wavering. "This is a restricted scene. There is a fugitive." "I see a marshal," Sister May said, her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, taking in everything. She saw Liza on the ground. She saw Tazin, bound. She saw Voss trying to hide behind his men. And she saw the sack at her feet. She bent and touched the Circle 5. "And I see my property." She held up her leather-bound logbook, the one from the cave. "I am a federal relief agent. Marshal, this sack, marked Circle 5, number 402, was part of a shipment of flour meant for my mission. It is listed right here." She tapped the book. "Stolen, along with rifles, gunpowder, and other supplies, from a convoy." The dust was settling. The wind was still shrieking, but the air was clearing, revealing the tableau in the yard. Voss, his men, Cobb, and this silent, watching crowd of the dispossessed. Tazin, bound, stepped forward. He looked at Sister May, the final piece of his memory, sharp and clear, clicked into place. He said, "I saw your wagon. Sister, I saw the fire. I was not the one who set it." Every eye turned to him. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the wind. "I was tracking them," he said, nodding toward Voss, who stood frozen. "His men, the ones in the white hats. They robbed your wagons. They set the fire. I tried to free the mules. I tried to save the supplies in the metal box. They shot me." He looked at Liza, then back at Sister May. "I tried to save your convoy." The truth, whole and complete, hung in the air. Clayton Voss, seeing the faces of the witnesses, seeing the iron certainty in Sister May's eyes, seeing his plan unravel, did what he always did. He tried to make a deal. He ignored Cobb. He ignored Tazin. He walked straight to Liza, who was struggling to her knees, clutching her shattered shoulder. "Liza," he said, his voice a low, reasonable purr. "It was just business. This is a misunderstanding, a terrible one. Look at your ranch. It is gone. You have nothing." He reached into his coat and pulled out the mortgage note. The summons. "Just be quiet," he whispered, holding the paper out to her. "Tell them you were confused. Tell them he forced you. Say anything. Just be quiet. And this," he shook the paper, "it all goes away. The debt is gone. You can keep your land. Just be quiet." Liza looked at the paper. It was her freedom. It was her land. It was the thing she had fought for. She looked up, past Voss, to Tazin. He stood bound, but his eyes were on her. He was not pleading. He was watching. He was trusting her. He had called her strong. She raised her good hand, her left hand. She took the note from the hand of Clayton Voss. Voss smiled, a thin, triumphant smile. Liza looked him in the eye, and with a slow, deliberate motion, she tore the paper in half. She tore it again, and again. She opened her hand and let the small white pieces of her debt, her security, her trap, flutter away in the wind, disappearing into the mud. "No," she said, her voice hoarse but clear. "I will see you in court." The smile vanished from the face of Voss. His face contorted in a spasm of pure hatred. "Cobb!" he roared. "Arrest him!" Marshal Cobb, his face gray, knew he had lost, but he still had his badge. He grabbed the rope binding Tazin. "Tazin, known Apache," he announced, his voice a cracked official monotone. "You are under arrest on the federal warrant for robbery. You will be held for a formal hearing before the county council. In 2 days. He would not arrest Voss. He could not, but he could take Tazin. He could separate them. He dragged Tazin toward his horse, pushing through the silent, watching crowd. It was not a victory, but it was a desperate, legal move. The fight was not over. It had only moved indoors. The town meeting hall was not a courtroom. It was a large, hot, wooden box, smelling of stale tobacco, unwashed bodies, and fear. Every bench was full. Clayton Voss, dressed in a fine black suit, sat at a front table with his lawyer, a sharp man from the capital. Voss looked untroubled, as if he were merely attending a livestock auction. He smiled and nodded at the men in the front rows. His men, the foremen and ranchers who depended on his goodwill. Behind them sat the tenant farmers and small merchants. They stared at the floorboards, their faces closed. To speak against Voss was to lose your job, to have your loan called in, to be ruined. Marshal Cobb stood by the door, his badge polished, his pistol heavy on his hip. He was the law. Liza Boone entered. The room went silent. Her right arm was bound tightly to her chest, her shoulder a deep, throbbing agony beneath her plain dress. The purple and yellow bruise was visible on her neck. She was a living testament to the violence of the men in charge. Sister May walked beside her, calm and severe, her worn logbook held against her chest. Liza did not look at the farmers who avoided her gaze. She looked at the back wall. It was full, standing, silent. Men and women from the mission, Apache elders, their faces impassive, their presence a weight that changed the air in the room. They had come not to speak, but to watch. Tazin was brought in last, his hands bound in front of him. He was seated on a lone chair. He looked only at Liza. He saw her strapped arm, and his jaw tightened. A local merchant, a nervous man named Harris, who also ran the bank, presided over the council. He read the charge in a thin voice. Tazin, an Apache of the NDA, was accused of armed robbery of a federal supply convoy and destruction of federal property. Voss's lawyer spoke first. He was smooth. He painted a picture of a savage, opportunistic raid by a renegade native, a threat to the safety of all civilized people in the territory. He praised Marshal Cobb for his swift, brave investigation. Marshal Cobb was called to testify. He stood tall. He lied with practiced ease. He stated he had followed tracks from the burned convoy. He said these tracks led to the Boone Ranch. He said he found Liza Boone under the influence of the fugitive, and when he attempted to arrest the savage, the man had resisted violently. forcing the marshal to defend himself and the girl. He said the fire in the canyon had been set by the Apache to destroy evidence. It was a clean story. It explained everything. A murmur of agreement went through the front benches. Then Harris, the banker, looked at Liza. He said, "Miss Boone, do you have anything to say in your defense? You are, after all, also implicated in harboring this man." Liza stood. The pain in her shoulder made her dizzy, but she locked her knees. She did not have a lawyer. She had only the truth. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and plain. She said, "I am not here to defend myself. I am here to tell the truth." She told them everything. She told them about finding Tazan, unconscious, hunted. She told them about the men who came for him. She told them about the fire that burned her pasture. She told them about the cave, and the rifles, and the gunpowder. Voss, his lawyer, laughed. He said, "A fantastic story. A fiction told by a frightened woman to protect her companion. Where is this proof Marshal Cobb told us it was all destroyed?" Sister May stood up. Her voice was not loud, but it had the authority of a church bell. She said, "Not all of it." She walked to the front, placing her logbook on the table. She said, "I am the federal relief agent for this district. This book is my manifest. It lists every item in that convoy." She nodded to Liza, who reached under the table, with her one good arm. Liza hauled the heavy, soot-stained canvas sack onto the table. The Circle 5 was stark and black. Sister May opened her book. She said, "Sack number 402, flour, 100 pounds, stolen. And here it is, in the possession of the men who claim to be investigating." The room was silent. The farmers in the middle rows were looking up. Voss spoke, his voice a genial boom. He said, "This is wonderful news. One of my sacks, stolen from my own stockyards, has been recovered. This only proves the Apache was raiding my property as well." Sister May said, "That is a lie. This sack is federal property, part of the shipment I was to receive." Voss smiled. He said, "Your word against mine, sister." Harris, the banker, looked troubled. He turned to Cobb. He said, "Marshal, you testified the Apache set the fire. Why did you not secure this sack as evidence?" Cobb began to sweat. He said, "The scene was dangerous. My priority was the fugitive." Harris looked at one of the deputies, a young man who had been quiet. He asked, "Deputy, did you see this sack at the ranch?" The deputy looked at Cobb. He looked at Voss. He looked at the floor. He muttered, "I just do what I am told." Harris said, "Speak up, son." The deputy looked up, his face pale and miserable. He said, "We all do what we are told. We all know who pays for the extra protection." A gasp went through the room. Protection money. It was an open secret, but it had never been said aloud. In this room, the hissing sound started, a low, angry vibration from the middle benches. Marshal Cobb's face was the color of ash. His authority, his legal power, had just evaporated. Voss saw it. He stood up, taking control. He said, "This is a distraction. We are here to try a murderer and a thief." He pointed at Tazan. He looked at Sister May. He said, "You brought the child, Mateo, the one who was kidnapped. Let him speak. Let him tell the council who he is afraid of." Sister May nodded, a grim, sad expression on her face. She led Mateo to the front. The boy was shaking, his eyes fixed on the floor. Voss leaned down, his voice thick with false sympathy. He said, "Son, did a bad man scare you? Did a bad man take you from your mother?" Mateo nodded, his small body trembling. Voss smiled at the council. He said, "You see, the child is terrified." Liza moved then. She knelt in front of the boy, a sharp pain shooting up her neck from the movement. She ignored it. She spoke softly, in her rough Spanish. She asked, "Mateo, the man who led them, what did he wear?" Mateo whispered, "A white hat." Voss, his smile tightened. He said, out loud, "A white hat. A dozen men here own a white hat. It proves nothing." Liza kept her eyes on the boy. She asked, "Did you see his face?" Mateo shook his head, just the hat and his hand. When he grabbed me, Liza asked. What about his hand, Mateo? The boy suddenly lifted his own hand, pointing. He was not pointing at Tazin. He was pointing directly at Clayton Voss. He said, his voice high and clear, his hand, it had a stain, a dirty spot, like that. Voss froze. He had been resting his right hand on the table. He instinctively pulled it back, covering his right wrist with his left cuff. But the movement was too late. The council, the farmers, everyone had seen it, the dark, splotchy birthmark on his wrist. Voss began to shout, calling it a trick. Liza stood slowly. She reached into her dress pocket. She pulled out a small, ragged piece of white felt. It was stained with sweat. She said, I found this in the cave, where the guns were. It was snagged on a nail. A woman in the crowd stood up. It was Vindemiatrix, the town seamstress. Her voice was thin, but sharp. She said, I know that felt. That is imported beaver felt. I have only ever used it once, to make a new hat for Mr. Voss, last spring. Voss was roaring now, calling them all liars, calling Liza a bitter, vengeful woman. He turned on Tazin. He yelled, he is the savage. He is the one who lies. Ask him if he saw my face. The room fell silent again. Harris, the banker, looked at Tazin. He said, Sir, you have heard the testimony. Do you have anything to say? Tazin stood. His hands were still bound. He walked to the front of the room. He looked at the council. He looked at Voss. He began to speak. His English was slow, measured, and clear. He did not shout. He said, I did not rob the wagon. I was tracking the men who did. I saw them move the supplies to the cave. I tried to free the mules. I tried to open the strongbox, to save the papers. He looked at Cobb. He said, the marshal did not fight me. The men in the white hats fought me. Voss sneered. He said, you saw my face in the dark. In a storm you can identify me. Tazin shook his head. He said, I did not see your face. I saw your hat, but I was close. The man who led them, the man who hit me with his pistol, I was very close to him. Voss, his confidence returned. He said, then you have nothing. Tazin said, I smelled him. The room was still. He said he smelled, not of sweat, not of whiskey. He smelled of mint, sweet, like leaves, mixed with his tobacco. Every person in the hall, every farmer, every merchant, knew that smell. It was the scent of Clayton Voss, the expensive, mint-laced tobacco he imported from the East. It clung to his fine clothes, a signature of his wealth. Clayton Voss said nothing. His face, for the first time, was slack with shock. He was trapped, not by a gun, but by a smell. The council members did not need to talk for long. Harris stood up, his face grim. He said, this council finds the charges against the man known as Tazin to be false and without merit. He is released. He pointed a shaking finger at Marshal Cobb. He said, Marshal Cobb, you are suspended from your duties, pending a full investigation by the territorial authorities for perjury and conspiracy. Then he looked at Clayton Voss. He said, Mr. Voss, you will be detained, held in your own jail, to await that same federal investigation. Two deputies, the ones who had not spoken, moved forward. They looked relieved. One of them took the badge from a stunned Cobb. The other put a hand on Voss, his shoulder. Tazin was free. A deputy cut his bonds. He walked to Liza, his face unreadable, and stood beside her. Liza felt a wave of dizziness. She had won. But Harris, the banker, was not finished. He looked at her, his face full of something close to pity. He said, Miss Boone, this hearing it was not about your loan. The note you tore it was a copy. The original is filed at my bank. The debt is still owed. The foreclosure hearing it is still set for next week. Lisa, her victory turned to ash. She had exposed the corruption. She had freed Tazin, but she was still going to lose her land. A sound, a single pair of hands, clapping. It was Vindemiatrix, the seamstress, then another farmer. In the middle, clapped, and another. It was not a cheer. It was a slow, steady, rising wave of applause. It filled the hot, stunned room. The people in the back, the Apache, did not clap. They did not make a sound. They simply stood, a silent, unmoving line of witnesses. The power in Dry River had not just been challenged. It had broken. The victory in the meeting hall was a cold, thin thing. It had no warmth. Clayton Voss and Marshal Cobb were in the town jail, a flimsy structure of wood and iron. But Voss was a man whose power was not contained by walls. His money was still his money. His influence was still a poison in the town's water. Liza Boone sat in the small, clean office of the mission. Sister May was gently, firmly, restrapping her right arm, the one Cobb had brutalized with his rifle. The pain was a dull, heavy, purple throb. Tazin stood by the window, his own shoulder healing, his back to the room, watching the sun set. He was a free man, but he was not free. He was still Apache in a white man's town. And Liza was still a debtor. "It is not right," Sister May said, her voice a low, angry hum. She was looking at a small stack of papers on her desk. They were Liza's papers, the ones Liza had given her for safekeeping weeks ago, before the first storm. "This is your original deed, and these are the chits from the Army quartermaster at Fort Grant, for the 3 wagons of hay you sold them last spring." "Voss was supposed to credit my account," Liza said, her voice tired. "His bank handled the payment. He told me the Army's paperwork was lost, that the payment never arrived." "He lied," Sister May said, tapping a different, heavier ledger, her own. "The quartermaster paid the bank in May. I have the requisition order and the payment stub right here. He not only failed to credit your account, he actively stole your payment. This foreclosure, it is not just predatory. It is fraudulent. This is the proof. He has to destroy this." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. Voss did not just want her land. He needed to bury his crime. A sound split the quiet evening. It was not a bell. It was a shout, high and full of terror. "Fire, fire at the mission!" Tazin spun from the window. "Smoke! From the refugee quarters!" They ran out into the courtyard. The small adobe huts where the refugee families lived were ablaze, the dry wood of the roofs catching instantly. But the fire had not started there. It was coming from the center of the mission, from Sister May's office. "He is out," Liza breathed, the words tasting like ash. "Voss is out." Men were pouring into the courtyard, not to help but to spread the chaos. It was Hank and Ames, and 4 other men from the Voss ranch. They carried torches and pistols. The 2 deputies who had been left to guard the jail were nowhere to be seen. "My office," Sister May cried, her face pale in the orange light. "My records. He is after the ledgers." She ran, not from the fire, but into it. Liza and Tazin followed, covering their faces against the smoke. The office was an inferno. The door was kicked in, and he was there. Clayton Voss. His fine suit was covered in soot, his face slick with sweat. He was not alone. The disgraced Marshal Cobb was with him, a pistol in his hand. Voss was shoving ledgers, papers, and a small metal strongbox into a saddlebag. "Looking for these, sister," Voss grinned, his teeth a white slash in the firelight. He held up the stack of papers he had taken from her desk, Liza's papers, the chits, the proof. "You will not," Sister May said, walking toward him, her hand outstretched. "In the name of God, you will not." Voss laughed. He grabbed her, his thick arm locking around her throat. He pressed his own pistol to her temple. "God has no say here, old woman, only I do." He shoved her backward, into Cobb. "Take her, she is our insurance." Cobb grabbed Sister May, his eyes wide and desperate. He was no longer a man of the law. He was a hunted animal. Voss threw the saddlebag over his shoulder, and they backed out of the burning room, dragging Sister May with them, disappearing into the smoke and the screams. By the time the townspeople had organized a bucket brigade, It was too late. The office was gutted. The refugee quarters were ashes, and Voss, Cobb, and their hostage were gone. Liza and Tazin stood by the smoldering ruins. The two deputies were found, tied and gagged, in the jail. "He has her," Liza whispered. "He has her, and he has my papers. He will destroy them both." Tazin knelt, his eyes on the ground. The fire had been doused with water, turning the courtyard into a slurry of mud and ash. He touched the tracks. 6 riders, Voss, Cobb, Hank, Ames, and 2 others. They have a mule. That is where they put the sister. "Where did they go?" Harris the banker asked, his face gray with shock. Tazin pointed north, toward the high, broken country. Dry Knife Canyon. He is going back, to the place he knows, to the high ground. "We are with you, Liza," a voice said. It was Jonas, the farmer who had clapped in the hearing. He held a hunting rifle. 3 other farmers stood with him, their faces grim. They were men who had nothing left to lose. They had horses. Liza mounted, her body moving on pure, cold rage. The pain in her shoulder a distant, manageable fire. Tazin refused a horse. "I am faster on the ground." He took the lead, running, not like a man, but like a deer, his feet seeming to barely touch the earth. They rode into the night, a small, desperate posse. The wind began to rise. Not a storm, but a high, thin, mournful sound, a wail that cut through the canyons. It was the sound of ghosts. Tazin never slowed. He led them through the dark, reading a story that Liza could not see. He would stop, touch a stone, look at a broken piece of brush, and change direction. He was a part of the darkness, a part of the land, and he was hunting. After 2 hours, he raised his hand. They stopped. The horses breathed hard, their breath pluming in the cold night air. "Up there," he whispered. High up, in a narrow, box-ended gulch, a tiny point of light flickered, a campfire. They left the horses, moving on foot. Tazin gave Liza his own knife, the one with the thunder mark. "If you must," he whispered. She took it in her good left hand. They crawled the last 100 yards, over cold rock. They looked down into the small clearing. Voss was there, the stolen saddlebag at his feet. He was sorting the papers, tossing ledger after ledger into the flames. Cobb stood guard over Sister May, who was tied to a piñon tree, her mouth gagged. Hank and Ames were drinking from a bottle, their rifles leaning against a rock. "Here it is," Voss crowed, holding up a small sheaf of papers. "Liza's chits. The last of it. Proof of payment. Well, the fire will be paid." He laughed and held them over the flames. Tazin put a hand on Liza's arm, his grip like iron. "Wait!" He pulled something from a leather pouch around his neck. It was small, white, and carved. A whistle, made from the bone of an eagle. He put it to his lips. A sound drifted down into the canyon. "Hoo! Hoo! Hoo!" The perfect 2-note call of a great horned owl. Hank looked up, his hand on his rifle. "Just an owl." "I hate those things," Cobb muttered, his eyes scanning the darkness. Tazin moved, silent as the shadow of a cloud. He was 10 yards away in a second. He blew the call again. "Hoo! Hoo! Hoo!" from a different place. "That ain't right," Hank said, standing up. "That bird is moving too fast." Cobb raised his rifle, pointing it into the darkness where the second call had come from. He was distracted. "Now," Tazin breathed. Liza moved. She did not go toward Tazin. She went the other way, scrambling down the rocks, using the shadows, circling behind the camp. She was a ghost. She reached the piñon tree. Sister May's eyes went wide. Liza raised Tazin's knife. With one slice, she cut the ropes binding the sister's hands. She ripped the gag from her mouth. "Voss?" Sister May screamed, her voice a righteous trumpet. Every man spun. Hank and Ames fumbled for their rifles. Voss saw Liza. a figure of vengeance in the firelight, and he raised his own pistol. A shot exploded from the darkness above. Not from Voss, it was Cobb, on the rocks, seeing the play. He was not aiming at Voss, he was aiming at Liza. Liza, Tazin roared. He was no longer a shadow. He was a blur of motion, launching himself from the rocks, across the clearing. He did not have time to stop Cobb. He only had time to intercept the bullet. He shoved Liza hard, spinning her to the ground. The bullet, meant for her back, tore through the bicep of his left arm. He staggered. A sharp cry of pain ripped from his throat, but he did not fall. He drew his own knife. Liza, on the ground, saw Voss. He had recovered his aim. He was pointing his revolver straight at her, his face a mask of hate. She had her father's pistol in her good left hand. There was no time to aim for his heart, no time to aim for his head. She aimed for the gun. She fired. The sound of her shot was followed by a loud, metallic ping. Voss screamed. A high, thin sound. He dropped his revolver as if it were on fire. The barrel of his gun had been struck. A piece of lead lodged in it, splitting the metal, jamming the cylinder. The gun was useless. It was over. Hank and Ames, seeing Voss disarmed, seeing Tazin wounded but alive, and seeing the dark shapes of Jonas and the other farmers appearing at the canyon mouth, rifles raised, threw their own weapons down. "We are done, boss," Hank said, raising his hands. "We are just done." Voss was trapped. He looked at the guns, at the grim faces. He looked at Cobb, who was frozen on the rocks, his rifle empty. Voss, the man of power, the man of paper, panicked. "It was Cobb," he shrieked, the words tumbling out. "He planned it. He planned the whole thing, the robbery, the guns. He forced me. He said he would expose. I just wanted the land. It was just a business deal. He forced me." "You liar," Cobb roared from the rocks. "You snake, you came to me, you paid me." "The gun running," Voss babbled, his mind breaking. "To the factions in Mexico. He had the contacts. He set up the network. I just handled the financing." Sister May was not idle. She had walked, calmly, to the saddlebag, pulling her logbook free from the flames. She found a pencil stub in her pocket. In the flickering firelight, she began to write. Her hand was swift and steady, recording every word of the confession. A new sound. More horses. It was Harris the banker, and the 2 deputies, and a dozen other men from Dry River. They had followed the trail of the fire. And then the sound of the gunshots. They arrived to a stunning scene. Clayton Voss, the most powerful man in the county, confessing his crimes to a nun. Marshal Cobb, trapped on a rock, disarmed. Hank and Ames, hands in the air. And in the center, Liza Boone, on her knees, her pistol smoking, and Tazin, standing over her, bleeding from a new wound, his knife in his hand. The farmers moved. "We have got no rope," Jonas said. Tazin gestured with his head. "The yucca, by the wash. It is stronger." Jonas and the others cut long, tough fibers from the yucca plants. They bound Hank and Ames. They climbed the rocks and dragged Cobb down, his protests ignored, and bound him. And they bound Clayton Voss, who was now weeping, a collapsed, pathetic figure. They were tied, not with hemp but with the rope of the desert itself. Liza stood up, her body shaking with reaction. She looked at Tazin, at his bleeding arm. "You are—" "It is a weather mark," he said, his voice tight with pain, but his eyes steady on hers. She looked at the sky. The wind, the high, fluting, screaming wind had stopped. The air was suddenly, profoundly still. She looked up, past the high canyon walls. The clouds had broken. The angry, swirling green and black was gone. The sky was a deep, clear, peaceful black, and the first clean stars were beginning to appear. The storm, all of it, was over. The wheels of true justice turned slowly, but they were heavier than the rock of the Chiricahuas. The confession of Clayton Voss, written in the steady hand of Sister May and backed by the federal government, had been enough. Voss and Cobb were gone, taken by territorial marshals to a prison in the capital. Their power in Dry River County broken like a dead branch. The town itself, waking from a long nightmare, was quiet, as if relearning how to breathe. Liza Boone was also healing. Her right shoulder was a mass of deep, purple and yellow bruising, the bones sore, but not broken. Sister May had insisted she keep the arm bound, and she was forced to learn the clumsy grace of living with her left hand. Tarzan's arm, the new bullet wound, was clean and mending. He was a silent, restless patient, unaccustomed to stillness. They worked, side by side, in the wreckage of her ranch. They salvaged wood. They cleared rubble. They spoke little, but the silence was a comfortable one. The silence of two people who had faced the same fire and walked out. A week after the hearing, a rider came from the territorial office. He was not a man Liza knew. He was a clerk, his clothes dusty but official. He carried a heavy leather satchel. He dismounted, looking at the ruin of the ranch, at the strange, peaceful partnership of the scarred woman and the Apache man, and he had the decency to look ashamed. He did not bring a summons. He brought a thick, folded document, the edges sealed with wax. It was the deed to the land of Liza, the original. The foreclosure is nullified. The clerk explained, his voice dry. The investigation proved Mr. Voss had misappropriated your payment from the Army. The debt was, in fact, paid in full last May. He held out another paper. This is a formal apology from the territorial governor and a writ of restitution. The account of Mr. Voss has been seized. This is for damages. It was a bank draft for an amount that made Liza's good hand shake. It was enough to buy seed, to buy wood, to buy new horses. It was enough to rebuild. She did not look at the money. She looked at the deed. She held the paper, the proof that this ground, her ground, was truly hers. The weight of the loan, a stone she had carried for years, dissolved. She felt so light she thought she might float away on the clear desert air. There was more good news. The testimony of Tarzan, his calm, clear description of the land, the fire, the water, had been part of the official report. It had reached the ears of the Federal Relief Commission. The funds for the mission, so long tangled in the red tape of men like Voss, had been released. They are digging a new well at the mission, Liza told Tarzan that evening, her voice full of a strange, new lightness, a deep one for everyone. Sister May says they will not lack for water again. The town of Dry River was changing. The fear was gone, replaced by a sullen, humbled silence, and then, slowly, by something else, action. The town council, the one that remained, was forced to hold new elections. The farmers, the ones who had sat in the middle, found their voices. When Liza rode the old mule into town for supplies, people no longer looked away. They did not stare at her scar. They looked her in the eye. Some, the men who had been in the hearing, nodded. It was a gesture of respect, a thing so new it startled her. Mr. Harris, the banker, the man who had presided over the hearing, stopped her on the boardwalk. He took off his hat, a nervous, fluttering gesture. "Miss Boone," he said, his voice low. That is to say, we, the town, we owe you an apology. We were blind. We let that man, we were cowards." Liza looked at his pale, worried face. She had spent a decade building armor against their scorn. She had no defense against their shame. "We all have work to do, Mr. Harris," she said, and left it at that. The town market reopened. The mood was not joyous, but it was steady. People were mending their lives. Mateo, the small boy, was there with his mother. They had a small stall, selling fresh tamales. When Mateo saw Liza, he broke free from his mother and ran, his small arms wrapping tightly around her legs. He was laughing. He was safe. His mother came, her eyes full of tears, and pressed a hot, corn husk-wrapped tamale into the good hand of Liza. It was a gift, a thank you, a beginning. One morning, as the sun was just beginning to warm the earth, they had visitors. They did not come from the town. They came, on foot, from the mountains. It was an Apache elder, the same one who had stood, silent and watchful, in the back of the meeting hall. 2 younger men walked with him. Tazin met them at the fence line. They spoke, their voices low and flowing, the language of the Ende. Liza watched from the porch, her arm still in its sling. The elder walked past Tazin. He walked directly to Liza. He was old, his face a beautiful map of time and sun. He looked at her, his eyes deep and black. He looked at her scar. He looked at her strapped arm. He nodded, a slow gesture of profound understanding. He did not speak to her. He walked to the new, miraculous well, the one Tazin had found. He touched the stone. He looked at the patch of blackened earth where her pasture had burned. Then he walked to a large, flat, sun-baked rock that lay near the foundation of her ruined kitchen. He knelt. He built a small, careful fire, no bigger than a man's hand, from sage and a sliver of cedar wood. The smoke rose, a thin, blue, fragrant line into the still morning air. He chanted, a low song, a blessing for the land. When the fire was only white ash, he took a piece of charcoal. On the flat surface of the rock, he drew a picture. It was a simple, powerful shape, a bird, its wings spread wide, its eye keen, a hawk, the sign of a protector. He was blessing her home. He was acknowledging her, not as an outsider, but as a keeper of this small piece of ground. When he was finished, he stood. He looked at Liza. "Dei," he said, "a sacred place." Then he and his men turned and walked back toward the mountains, vanishing into the landscape from which they had come. That night, Liza could not sleep. The house was quiet. The moon was high. She found the small, tarnished brass hand mirror that had belonged to her mother. She had not truly looked at her reflection in 10 years. She had seen herself in flashes, in the window glass, in the water trough. She had seen the ugly girl, the freak. She held the mirror up. The moonlight was clear, kinder than the sun. She saw her face, the right side, her mother's side, smooth and pale, and the left, the puckered, silvered skin, the eye drawn slightly tight at the corner. She touched it, her fingers tracing the line. She heard the voices, ugly, monster, curse. Then she heard another voice, his voice, low and certain in the memory of the rain-soaked shed. Not ugly. Weathermark, strong. She looked at the reflection. She saw the 12-year-old girl who had run into a burning barn. She saw the woman who had dragged a stranger from a storm. She saw the person who had faced down Cobb and Voss and the judgment of an entire town. "Weathermark," she whispered to the woman in the glass. "It is my Weathermark." For the first time, the word did not feel like a lie. It felt like the truth. She was not the ugly girl. She was Liza Boone. She was a survivor. She put the mirror down. The long, cold war with herself finally, quietly, over. They began to rebuild. With the money, she bought lumber. Good, straight pine from the north. She bought nails and glass for the windows. Jonas, the farmer from the hearing, came with his 2 sons. They did not ask for pay. They came to help. "A neighbor," Jonas said, as they raised the first beam of the new barn, "should act like one. We forgot that for a while." Tazin worked with them. His left arm was still weak, but he was strong. He moved with a builder's grace, his motions sure. He and Jonas, the white farmer and the Apache warrior, worked together, raising a roof against the sun. Liza planted. She planted rows of corn and beans. She planted yucca, the plant that had bound the evil and given her strength. One evening, at dusk, she heard a sound, a familiar sound, a high, clear whinny. She ran from the house. Standing by the new half-built corral were two horses. They were thin, their coats matted, but they were hers. The two mares she had lost in the tornado. They had found their way home. Liza put her face into the mane of the older mare, and she wept. She had not cried for the house or the barn, but she cried for her horses. Tarzan found her there, her good arm wrapped around the neck of the mare. He said nothing. He walked to the edge of the pasture, where the new grass was beginning to grow. He gathered handfuls of it, the long, sweet stems. He sat on the ground, and in the twilight, he began to braid. He made two small, intricate rings of woven grass. He stood, and with a soft, murmuring sound, he tied one ring into the mane of each horse. Liza wiped her face. "What is that for?" "It is a sign," he said. "For my people, it means this one is protected. This one is cared for. This one is home." He was sitting on the porch 2 days later. He was carving a small, flat piece of juniper wood, the knife in his right hand moving with practiced skill. He handed the piece of wood to her. He had carved a symbol, a series of swirling, beautiful lines that looked like the wind itself. "I do not understand," she said. "It is you," he said. "The wind that clears the sky, the clean wind." Liza held the small piece of wood. It was warm from his hand. She went inside, to the small table that had survived. She took out her father's Bible, the one with the blank pages at the back. She found a clean sheet. She took her small pot of ink and her pen. Her right arm was still stiff, but she would not use her left. She carefully, painstakingly, wrote his name, Tahzin. She tore the page from the book and tacked it to a small, smooth piece of salvaged pine. She hung it on the wall, just inside her door. It was his name, a sign that this, too, was his home. The barn was finished. The roof was strong. The stalls were clean. The air smelled of new wood and hay. Sister May rode out, her mule looking fat and content. Mateo and his mother were with her. Sister May looked at the new barn, her sharp eyes taking in the strong beams, the clean lines. "It is a good barn, Liza, a strong barn." "It is," Liza agreed. "It is a fine schoolroom," Sister May said, a new idea bright in her eye. Liza looked at her. "A school. The children?" Sister May said, gesturing to Mateo. "The Apache children, the Mexican children, they have no letters. The children in town, they are full of the old stories, the old hate. We need a new story." She proposed it, right there, a class, a few days a week, here, on this neutral ground, this blessed ground, a place where children could learn. You can read. Liza Boone, your father taught you well. You could teach them. With me. Liza looked at the strong, new barn. She looked at Mateo, who was shyly showing Tarzan a bird's nest he had found. She looked at Tarzan, who was watching her, a small, rare smile on his face. "Yes," Liza said, the word feeling as strong and true as the beams above her. "Yes, I will." That evening, the work was done. The air was cool and sweet. Liza stood by her new door, the one that held his name. Tarzan stood beside her. They were not touching, but they stood in the same space, watching the sun set. The sky was a deep, clear, peaceful purple. High above, a single speck moved against the color, a hawk riding the high currents, its circles wide and easy. Liza watched it. She felt the old, puckered skin on her cheek, the ache in her shoulder, the solid ground beneath her feet. The hawk was not an omen. It was not a warning. It was just a hawk, and it was free. The rebuilding took the last of the summer. The new barn stood tall, its raw pine smelling of the future. The house was whole, the kitchen larger than before, with 2 clear glass windows that let in the morning light. The land, too, was mending. New, thin grass, encouraged by the digging of the well, had begun to sprout where the fire had blackened the earth. Life was returning. The town of Dry River was also rebuilding. In its own way, Harris, the banker, rode out to the ranch. He was a changed man, quieter, his face etched with a shame he could not hide. He sat awkwardly on Liza's new porch, twisting his hat in his hands. "The council, Liza," he began, not meeting her eye. We have elected Jonas, the farmer, as the new marshal. He is a good man, a fair man." "He is," Liza agreed. She was shelling beans, her good left hand and her stiff right hand working together. "And," Harris continued, "we have drafted new town rules. For the market, Sister May, she insisted, fair weights and a clause, protection, for all residents, including the NDE, the Apache, and the Mexican families. They have the same rights to trade, the same protections at the church, as any of us." "That is good," Liza said, the words simple. Harris finally looked at her. "Liza, this ranch, it is a hard life. You have been through so much. The restitution money, it is a considerable sum. You could sell this place, sell it to the cooperative. You could have a house in town, a fine house. You could be comfortable." Liza stopped shelling the beans. She looked out, not at Harris, but at the land, at the flat rock where the hawk was drawn, a guardian mark, at the new barn, where the sound of children's voices could be heard. Sister May had started her school. Mateo, and Jonas's youngest son, and 2 shy Apache girls were inside, learning their letters. She looked at the man beside her. Tarzan. He was not on the porch. He was in the yard, working. He was patiently, silently, teaching Jonas's son how to set a new kind of trap, a humane one, for catching quail. He was a part of this place now. He was a part of her. "What is freedom, Mr. Harris?" Liza asked, her voice quiet. He looked confused. "Why, it is not being in jail. It is having money. It is—" "No," Liza said. She touched her scarred cheek. The weather mark. She was not ashamed of it. It was her map. "For 10 years, this town looked at me and saw a curse. They despised me, and I despised them back. I was in a jail, Mr. Harris. We all were." She stood up, and for the first time, Harris saw the woman she had become. She was not the ugly girl. She was Liza Boone, the owner of this land, the guardian of that school. "Freedom," Liza said, "is not comfort. It is not a house in town. It is the right to work this ground, my ground, and not be scorned for it. It is the right to love who I choose, and not be hunted for it." She looked at Tarzan, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. "This is my home. I am not selling." Harris stood. He put his hat on. He looked at her scarred face, at the strength in her eyes, and he nodded. He finally understood. "God bless you, Miss Boone," he said, and he meant it. The land echoed the peace that autumn. The rains came. They were not the violent, tearing winds of the tornado. It was a long, slow, steady rain, a blessing that soaked deep into the thirsty earth. The new well, the one Tarzan had found, filled to the brim, and for one whole day, it overflowed, the water running in a clean, bright stream, washing away the last of the ash. The 2 mares, her beloved horses who had returned, were sleek and healthy, and one morning, Liza went to the barn to find a new life. The older mare stood over a small, wet, leggy foal, a filly, perfect and strong. It was a sign. The land was not just healing, it was growing. That evening, the sky was clear, the air washed clean, the stars so bright they looked like holes punched in a black, velvet sky. Tarzan led her by her good hand. They walked, not speaking, to the high-mounted rock that overlooked her valley, the same place she had watched the storm come in. They stood there for a long time. The silence comfortable, complete. Tarzan looked at a tough, ancient mesquite tree, its roots dug deep into the rock of the cliff, holding on, refusing to be moved. "The wind," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It is strong. It can tear down a barn, but it always chooses the root. The root holds the earth. It is where the wind stops." Liza understood. He was Tazin. Still wind. He was the wind. And she was this land, this ranch, this root. She turned, her scarred face open to him in the starlight. She looked at his face, at the way his eyes held the night. "The wind chose," she said, her voice thick, "and I choose the human." He took her hand, not the calloused working part, but her wrist. He did not pull her. He just held her. "Liza," he said. He had never used her name before. It sounded new. "You are not a root. You are the tree. You are the one who grows." She leaned her head against his good shoulder, the one that was not scarred by a bullet. He held her, his arm secure around her. They were not married in a church. They were not bound by a paper from the law. Their union was a thing of the desert, of the sky. They gathered their witnesses a few days later, under that same starry sky. Sister May came, her face soft in the moonlight. Jonas, the new marshal, came, his hat in his hand. Mateo and his mother came, bringing a small pot of sweet corn. Tazin held out a thin, supple strip of tanned leather, the kind he used for his medicines. Liza held out a similar strip, one she had cut from her father's old saddle harness. They stood before Sister May. They did not speak of love. They spoke of truth. "You came to me in the storm," Liza said, her voice steady, looking only at him. "And you saw me. You did not turn me away." Tazin replied, his gaze locked with hers. "You gave me sanctuary. You are Kinlani, the safe harbor." He was not her savior. She was not his. They were survivors. They were partners. Sister May said, "The world does not know what to call this, but God does. It is a promise." Tazin and Liza, together, tied the two strips of leather. They wove them, their four hands working, until they formed one strong, unbreakable knot. Tazin did not say, "You are my wife." He said, "I am your guardian." Liza did not say, "You are my husband." She said, "And I am yours." They would guard each other's freedom. Their new life took on a rhythm, the rhythm of the school, of the mending fences, of the new foal learning to run. The town accepted them, in its own quiet, humbled way. When the Apache elders came down from the mountains to trade, they no longer stopped at the edge of town. They stopped at Liza's ranch. And Marshal Jonas, he ensured their passage was safe. One cold morning in the late fall, a rider came, his horse near collapse. He was from a homestead 30 miles south, a family wiped out by a sudden flash flood that had come down a canyon. A different kind of storm. They had nothing. They were starving. Sister May started the collection. The town, the one that had been so selfish, so blind, responded. Harris gave money. The farmers, Jonas at the lead, loaded a wagon with sacks of their own precious grain. The wagon was heavy. It needed a guide. It needed protection. Liza and Tazin stood by the wagon, the two mares hitched in a strong new harness. Tazin swung himself up onto the seat. He held down his good hand. Liza took it, and he pulled her up beside him. She sat tall, her scarred face turned toward the south. He took the reins. Sister May, Jonas, and Mateo stood by, watching. "You will be back?" Mateo asked, his voice small. "We will be back," Liza promised. "The school needs its teacher." Tazin looked at her, a question in his eyes. She nodded. She was ready. He snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, its wheels cutting a new track in the damp earth. They rode out, together. Not running from a storm, but carrying aid, a man and a woman, leaving their own safe harbor to bring it to others. They were a new story, heading into the vast, open, dangerous, and beautiful land. The desert keeps its memory in wind. People keep each other with promises. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video, and give that hype button a press to help this story reach more people.